11, Mind and Body, Part 4. So we're going to look at our Greek ideal of the athlete. One thing to note is that in ancient Greece, we're talking 2,000 years ago, a little bit more, give or take, the physical form that we're going to see are going to be nude young males at the height of their athletic ability. And athletes in ancient Greece, the Olympics, for instance, but there were other wrestling matches and so on, they were naked, okay? They had no clothing on when they were performing, athletic events. So it's kind of interesting, different quality of thought. They didn't have Lycra back then. That might be one reason. But at any rate, when they're wrestling with each other and things like that, they're covered in oil so that you can't grab them easily, and it would increase their chances of not being thrown down. So that's one part of it. There's no clothing to grab onto. So the human being, in particular, this athletic ideal was very important to the Greeks, and the humans were capable of perfection, and they embodied the perfection of the gods. And the fit body, the fitness, that showed that you were intelligent, and it showed that you were of good moral character. Now, we know that these things are not exactly true. I mean, of course, it always helps that, your brain works better if your body's working better. There's truth to that. But this was just a thing that they believed in terms of their ideals at that time. We still carry that forward into the modern day in a kind of an extreme version of that. And we'll look at an example of that in the artwork at the end of this chapter, toward the end. Emotions were less important, and nudity was common, and it was glorified. Okay, so in saying all of that, the reason this looks so realistic 2,000 years ago, same time as the Egyptians, a little bit of overlap. The Egyptians don't do this because their aesthetic and their idealization has to do with permanence. But if you notice how this stone is carved out and there's all this open area, this is a very vulnerable statue. There is stone under his foot, if you notice that, and then this sort of tree decides to be there because we want to make sure he's not too vulnerable, because these sort of narrow ankles aren't going to be enough to support the whole piece. It'll have weak points. So the Egyptians carve it in the same form, similar, but without gaps, and it also isn't as realistic because that's not as important. They're not focused on revering man himself. Okay? The other thing you want to think about here, he's slightly larger than life, which is typical with Greek nudes. But you want to think about this is what we call contrapposto, the S curve. So when he is putting all his weight on this right leg, then the muscles in the abdomen and so on are a little more charged and a little more flexed, so that you get a better sense of his physical self. So this is called contrapposto. It's sort of an S. This is kind of a slight one. Usually the shoulders drop down just a little bit more. So this is our classic Greek style, classical Greek. There's different eras of Greek work that we're gonna look at a different one as well, because there's one previous to this. I'm forgetting the name of, but it's the archaic, the classic, and then the Hellenic. So Polykleitos developed this canon proportions about the ideal body parts, contrapposto. So there's two Italian terms you really have to know that start with C. One is chiaroscuro, which is the shading in a drawing or a painting to make it look three-dimensional, and the other one is contrapposto, which is counterbalanced. Okay, so realistic way that we might put weight on one leg. Zeus or Poseidon to Doryphoros. There are very similars here in these classical Greek pieces. He still has the archaic hair a little bit, that sort of stylized hair, but a lot of musculature here. This isn't contrapposto because he's standing with his legs apart. It's almost if you think about yoga, this is almost like warrior one pose. But these both have this athletic, muscular bodies. Okay, now we're going to look at an African piece here on the right. And in much of African art and in African culture of this time, I don't know if this is still true, but this is 20th century, meaning probably about 100 years ago or so. The head and the neck are the most important parts of the body. So that is why they're so enlarged. Okay, so if that's the ideal for that culture, that's what we're going to see. So the head and neck are important. So it takes up about a third of the body here, a third of the entire figure, right? So that's what's important to this African culture. So that's what we're going to see. The patterns with scarification. You see those in the wood. You could probably make that look somewhat realistic, but you get the general idea. Realism is not what we're going for here, so that's not what you see. Abstraction is important, and to show the soul in a lot of African cultures. And then we bring this forward into modernism too, is that to show the soul, then you would abstract the form. So these are internal proportions, not external, not meaning the actual body, but the idea of the belief about that head being important. Okay?